In Willow Creek, a small town that seemed forgotten by time, the sun dipped gently beneath the horizon, painting the streets with shades of orange. The wooden houses lined up along the main road still carried the scent of old timber and lavender from the gardens. It was a place where everyone knew each other, and secrets were rarely kept hidden for long. Life followed a steady rhythm, as if nothing could disrupt the peaceful pace of this quiet town. But that spring something stirred deep within Willow Creek, not in a physical sense, but in something more profound, something visceral. The dirt roads, usually still, had become busier than usual. Emergency meetings had been held in recent weeks, and the doors of the church were left wide open, as if something monumental was about to unfold. Reverend Elijah Carter, 45 years old, always seen as the town's moral pillar, had announced something that rattled the very foundation of the community. What began as a mere speculation soon escalated into a series of events no one could have predicted. The Reverend spoke with fervor, as he always did, his eyes burning with an uncontrollable passion, his words slicing the air with precision. He claimed that the young women of Willow Creek were fulfilling an ancient prophecy, a fate that had been destined to unfold. Alice, Rose, Betty, Evelyn, Ruth, Clara, Mabel, Hazel, Florence, Edith, Dorothy, Esther, and Agnes, 13, 16-year-old girls, daughters of the town's most devout families, were all pregnant. Not one nor two, but all of them simultaneously. Each one, like the others, was a virgin with angelic faces and innocent smiles. They had been raised under the strict teachings of Reverend Elijah. They were the living examples of purity and faith. When the news spread, a shockwave ran through Willow Creek. Never before had anything like this happened. No one knew how to handle it. How could they? In a town where marriages were arranged, where families took pride in keeping their children on the straight and narrow, what had happened to these girls was inexplicable. The parents were divided. Some fell to their knees in prayer, others locked themselves in their homes, refusing to speak with anyone. But one thing was clear. No one knew what to do. The answer, as if inevitable, came from Reverend Elijah himself. He claimed this was not an accident, but a divine intervention. The girls, according to him, were the chosen ones. They are the bearers of the new age, he said with chilling certainty. They are the instruments of a great change, a purification of humanity. It is written in the Scriptures that the sacrifice of a new generation would be necessary to bring light once again. This is the will of God. The Reverend's words, like a spell, took hold of many hearts and minds. Who would dare question a man who had dedicated his life to the church and the town? His deep eyes and confident voice left no room for doubt. People began to look at the girls differently. They were no longer just teenagers. They were symbols, not of sin, but of a divine revelation. But while Willow Creek's families were torn, something darker began to form in the shadows. The girls now were no longer just bearers of a divine message. They were the center of a storm, a silent battle between faith and doubt, between control and freedom. Each one, though surrounded by the reverence of the community, carried with her a deep, incomprehensible mystery. The cold wind that sliced through the narrow streets of Willow Creek brought with it a feeling that something bigger was on the way, something that would challenge everything the people believed to be true. and though the town continued to function as usual during the day, something had changed that night. Something was about to unfold, and no one, not the Reverend, nor the girls, nor the parents, could foresee where it would lead them. The days that followed were a blur of whispers and hushed conversations. The townspeople of Willow Creek, who had once greeted each other with warm smiles and friendly waves, now avoided eye contact. Every glance seemed loaded with judgment, confusion, or fear. The once bustling marketplace had become eerily quiet, with people rushing to finish their errands and retreat back into the safety of their homes. The heavy weight of the news hung in the air, thick and suffocating, and everyone felt it. In the town square, the church bell rang with an intensity that made even the strongest hearts flinch. It was a call to prayer, and as always the Reverend's influence was undeniable. The doors of the church were open wide, beckoning the townspeople to seek solace in the only place they believed could offer answers. Reverend Elijah had, after all, declared that this was not an occurrence of chance, but the will of God, and in Willow Creek, where the church stood at the center of everything, his words carried the weight of truth. Alice, Rose, Betty, Evelyn, Ruth, Clara, Mabel, Hazel, Florence, Edith, Dorothy, Esther, and Agnes, all the girls, were called upon to stand before the congregation, their swollen bellies a stark contrast to the image of purity they had once embodied. The Reverend's gaze followed them, a mixture of pride and something darker, more possessive as they made their way to the altar. There was no room for doubt in his eyes. He believed without hesitation that the prophecy had come true. "Behold," he announced, his voice trembling with emotion, "the chosen daughters of Willow Creek. These young women carry within them the future of our world. Their sacrifice will cleanse us, and through them we shall be reborn." The congregation, silent at first, erupted into a mixture of awe and fear. Some stood, hands raised in prayer, while others knelt in reverence. But among them a few faces remained unchanged, betraying the turmoil that stirred beneath the surface. Among the parents the divisions grew. Some were unwavering in their faith, embracing the Reverend's words without question, certain that their daughters were fulfilling a sacred mission. Others, however, began to doubt. Were their daughters truly instruments of divine will, or had something darker taken place? The doubt gnawed at them, threatening to tear their loyalty to the church apart. Esther's father, Thomas, a man who had been a pillar of the community for years, sat in the back of the church with his face hidden in his hands. His heart ached as he stared at his daughter. The girl he had raised with so much love, now the center of a prophecy he couldn't fully understand. The love he felt for her was tangled with fear, uncertainty, and guilt. He had spent so many years teaching her to honor God and follow His word. How could this be part of his plan? Across the room, Ruth's mother, Eleanor, fidgeted with the hem of her dress. She had always believed in the Reverend's teachings, had always trusted him as the spiritual guide of their lives. But now, as she watched her daughter stand before the congregation, her heart twisted with confusion. How could Ruth, so sweet and innocent, be part of something so unnatural? But in the midst of the confusion, there was one thing that remained certain to the people of Willow Creek: the Reverend's authority. His word was law, and though some questioned, none dared to speak out. The fear of what might happen if they did, if they defied the very foundation of their lives kept their voices locked in their throats. For the girls, the weight of the prophecy was unbearable. Though their lives had been dictated by rules and teachings, this was beyond anything they had ever imagined. To be told they were the chosen ones to carry the future of humanity within them was a burden far heavier than their young shoulders could bear. Alice, the quietest of them all, found herself standing at the altar, her gaze fixed on the Reverend. His eyes shone with a mixture of pride and possessiveness, as though they belonged to him, as though their lives had been shaped by his will alone. She couldn't help but wonder, what did this all mean for them? Were they truly chosen, or were they pawns in a game that none of them fully understood? Rose, standing beside Alice, clenched her fists. She had always been the rebellious one, the girl who asked too many questions, the one who could never fully accept the boundaries imposed upon her. Now, more than ever, those questions burned in her mind. What was the truth? And why had this prophecy been placed upon them, the innocent daughters of Willow Creek? For Betty, the youngest of the group, the confusion was overwhelming. She didn't understand what was happening. She had always trusted her parents, trusted the Reverend, and now she felt as though her entire world was crumbling around her. How could she have become the center of a divine plan she didn't even believe in? Each of the girls, trapped between fear, faith, and doubt, found themselves questioning their roles in the unfolding drama. The Reverend's words had shaken them. Yes, but in that shaking something else had begun to stir within them, a desire for answers, for the truth. And deep down they all knew that the answers they sought wouldn't come from the pulpit. They would have to look elsewhere. The days following Reverend Elijah Carter's fiery proclamation were filled with an undercurrent of tension that neither prayer nor time could seem to soothe. The town of Willow Creek, once a harmonious community, had become a place divided. The lines had been drawn clearly. There were those who trusted the Reverend completely, those who stood by their daughters despite the mystery, and those who dared to ask questions, their voices growing ever more hesitant in the face of growing fear. Though the church had filled with an almost holy fervor every Sunday as the girls' pregnancies advanced, so too did the distance between the townspeople. It was a strange phenomenon, almost as if the Reverend's declaration had broken the very bonds that held them together. People looked at each other as if seeing something new, something unsettling. Every glance seemed to carry a hidden question, an uncertainty that they no longer felt safe to voice aloud. In the Carter household, the Reverend's wife, Miriam, had been quiet ever since that fateful Sunday. She was a woman of grace, known for her gentleness and kind demeanor. But even she could not ignore the shift that had overtaken her town. She watched her husband with growing concern. Elijah's obsession with the prophecy seemed to grow stronger with each passing day, his eyes shining with a fervor that unsettled her. His behavior had always been intense, but now it bordered on something darker. One evening, after he had come home late from yet another council meeting, Miriam sat him down at the dinner table. The candlelight flickered between them as she met his gaze, her hands nervously folding the edge of her napkin. "Elijah, I've been thinking," she began, her voice soft but steady. "Are you sure this is what's meant to happen? I mean, these girls, our daughters, are they really the ones the Lord has chosen?" He looked at her sharply, his jaw tightening, as if the question itself stung. "Miriam, the Lord's will is clear. I have seen the signs, and I will not allow doubt to take root in my heart." Miriam looked down at her hands, her heart heavy with a weight she hadn't been able to shake. "But what if there's something we don't see? What if we're being led astray?" The silence that followed felt like a chasm between them. Elijah's eyes darkened, and Miriam could feel his growing impatience. He leaned forward, his voice low and dangerous. "Do not question what has been revealed to me, Miriam. You know better than anyone that I've devoted my life to this community. You trust me, don't you?" Miriam swallowed hard. She had trusted him. She still did, but the growing unease was too much to ignore. She nodded quietly, not wanting to provoke him further, but a part of her was unsettled. She knew something was changing in Elijah, something that scared her. Elsewhere in town, the girls faced their own private battles. While they walked the same streets, shared the same classrooms, and attended the same church, each one carried the unbearable weight of being the focus of an entire town's gaze. The Reverend had made sure to remind them constantly of their sacred duty, but in the privacy of their thoughts, the doubt that simmered beneath the surface only grew louder. Rose, who had always been the most vocal among them, found herself retreating from the group. The others noticed, but none of them dared to confront her. Rose had always been the one to ask the hard questions, the one who refused to fall in line. But now even she seemed to be lost, unsure of who to trust. One afternoon, as the girls gathered at the local diner, the air was thick with the unspoken questions. Their usual conversations had died down, replaced by an oppressive silence. They sat together at a corner booth, the checkered floor beneath them, cold and distant. The hum of the old jukebox in the background offering the only sense of normalcy. Alice, the quiet one, spoke first. "I don't think I can keep pretending," she said, her voice barely a whisper. The other girls looked at her, their eyes filled with a mixture of concern and curiosity. "I mean, we're supposed to be the chosen ones," Alice continued, "but none of us even know why or how this happened. We're just being told what to do, and I don't know if I believe in it anymore." Rose shifted uncomfortably in her seat. "You think we're just pawns in some game?" she asked, a hint of anger in her voice. "You think the Reverend is lying?" Alice hesitated. "I don't know, but something doesn't feel right. It's like we're being used." There was a long pause as the weight of Alice's words settled over the table. None of them knew how to respond, each girl lost in her own turmoil. Evelyn, who had been the most silent among them, spoke up softly. "But what if it is true? What if we are supposed to do this? I mean, the Reverend says it's God's will." "That's just it," Rose said, her voice sharp. "We don't know what's true anymore. The more I think about it, the more it feels like we've been kept in the dark. We were taught to follow blindly, but now I don't know if I can anymore." The conversation grew tense, and though none of the girls said it outright, they all understood the unspoken truth. They were trapped. Whether it was by faith, fear, or the Reverend's manipulation, they no longer had control over their own lives. In the days that followed, the pressure of their roles weighed more heavily upon them. The town's expectations and the Reverend's authority seemed to close in on them, leaving them no room to breathe. But something was changing. The girls could feel it. The Reverend's once gentle hand of guidance was beginning to tighten around their throats. He was watching them closely now, as if expecting them to prove their devotion in ways that were becoming more demanding by the day. And for the first time the girls felt the stirring of something far more dangerous than doubt. The town of Willow Creek was no longer the quaint, peaceful place it had once been. The rumors, the whispers and hushed corners of homes, and the ever-growing tensions had started to erode the very fabric of the community. What had once been a united town, bound by shared faith and values, was now a fragmented reflection of its former self. And it was all because of the 13 girls. As the weeks passed, the girls once seen as symbols of purity had begun to feel the full weight of their predicament. With every passing day, the town grew more obsessed with their pregnancies. The local diner was a constant gathering point for discussions and theories. Mrs. Harper, a widow who had lived in Willow Creek for over 50 years, often sat in the corner booth with her friends, her voice trembling as she spoke. "It's a test from the Lord," she would say, eyes wide with certainty. "He's sending a message, a prophecy, a warning." Her friends nodded, but there was unease beneath their fervent words. Deep down, some wondered if the Reverend had perhaps overstated his claim. They were afraid to question it, of course. Elijah Carter was not just their spiritual leader, he was the very cornerstone of their lives. To go against him would be to go against God himself, or so they had been taught. Still, behind closed doors, cracks were beginning to form. Miriam, Elijah's wife, had been growing more withdrawn with each passing day. She could not shake the feeling that something had gone terribly wrong. She had seen Elijah's obsession with the prophecy deepen, and with it his control over the girls. She noticed the subtle shifts in the way he spoke to them, more commanding, less compassionate. There was something unsettling about it, but Miriam, torn between her love for her husband and the creeping doubts in her mind, said nothing. One night, as Elijah returned late from yet another meeting with the town's council, Miriam confronted him. "Elijah," she said, her voice trembling, "are you sure about this? Are you sure this is what the Lord wants?" He looked at her with a hardness she had never seen before. "What do you mean, Miriam? You question me now?" I don't know," she stammered, trying to find the right words. "But you've changed. You're not the man I married. You're so consumed by this prophecy that I don't even recognize you anymore." Elijah's expression darkened. He walked toward her, his face inches from hers. "I am doing the Lord's work, Miriam. You know that. If you cannot support me in this, then perhaps you should leave." His words hit her like a slap in the face. Miriam stepped back, shock and hurt flashing across her face. She had never seen him like this. There had always been a quiet authority in him, but now it seemed like something darker was rising beneath the surface. The next morning, as she sat alone at the breakfast table, Miriam couldn't help but wonder what had become of the man she once knew. She looked out the window, watching as the town went about its day, blissfully unaware of the storm that was brewing just beneath the surface. Meanwhile, the girls were facing their own turmoil. The pressure was building, and they all felt it. The Reverend's expectations had become more explicit, and the weight of their pregnancies, coupled with the knowledge that the town was watching them with both reverence and suspicion, was taking its toll. Rose, ever the defiant one, had become more withdrawn. She had stopped attending the weekly meetings at the church, instead opting to spend time alone or with a few close friends. She had always been skeptical of the Reverend's teachings, But now, more than ever, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. One afternoon, she and Alice met in the small park behind the church, a place where the girls used to gather before all this had started. It was quiet, peaceful even, but there was an undeniable tension in the air. "I can't take this any more," Rose said, her voice barely a whisper. "I feel like I'm suffocating. I can't keep pretending everything is fine when I know it's not." Alice looked at her with concern. "What do you mean?" The Reverend doesn't care about us." "Alice," Rose interrupted, her voice rising. "He only cares about the prophecy, about his own power. I don't know what's worse, the fact that he's using us or the fact that we're letting him." Alice was silent for a long moment, her thoughts racing. She had been struggling with her own doubts, but she couldn't bring herself to fully accept what Rose was saying. The Reverend had always been kind to them. He had taught them everything they knew about faith, about love, about purity. But now it felt like he was pushing them into something they didn't understand. "I don't know what to do," Alice finally admitted. "I don't know if I can trust him any more." "I don't think we can trust anyone," Rose replied bitterly. "But we can't just stand by and let him destroy us." Later that evening, the girls were summoned to the church once again. Reverend Carter's voice echoed through the town, inviting the girls and their families to gather in the sanctuary for another of his impassioned speeches. There, in the hallowed space, he continued to build his case for the prophecy, his words growing bolder with each passing week. "The Lord has chosen you, my dear daughters," he said, standing before them with his arms outstretched. "You are the vessels through which his will is made manifest. The world will be changed through you. You are the purifiers. Do not let doubt or fear cloud your faith. The time is at hand." But even as his words filled the air with a false sense of grandeur, a sense of unease settled over the girls. They could feel it, the tightening grip of control, the manipulation that had once seemed so subtle, now glaringly obvious. And as the Reverend's eyes scanned over them, a strange sense of betrayal filled the room. They were no longer innocent vessels of faith. They were pawns in a dangerous game. As the service ended and the girls slowly filed out of the church, none of them spoke a word. They didn't need to. The truth had become undeniable. The Reverend had orchestrated their lives, and they had no choice but to follow. But that would not last much longer. The air in Willow Creek was thick with tension. The sun seemed to shine just a little less brightly these days, casting a shadow over the town that wasn't caused by the clouds, but by the growing divide between its people. There was a deep, gnawing feeling that something was terribly wrong, though no one could fully articulate what it was. The news of the girls' pregnancies had stirred up more than just gossip. It had shaken the very foundations of their beliefs. The Reverend's grip on the town was slipping, and with each passing day, cracks began to appear in the walls he had so carefully built around them. The girls, for the most part, were beginning to see through the Reverend's manipulation. It hadn't been an easy realization, but it was there, hanging in the air like a dark cloud. Their lives, once filled with hope and certainty, had been appended by the Reverend's obsession with his prophecy. And it wasn't just about the pregnancies anymore. It was about control, power. And the more the girls learned, the more they began to question everything they had been taught. It was Ruth who first suggested they talk about it openly. She had always been quiet, reserved, but something inside her had snapped, She couldn't stay silent any longer. One afternoon, while most of the town was attending another church meeting, the girls gathered at the old barn on the edge of town. It was a place they had once used for secret meetings and hideaways back when they were younger and carefree, before the Reverend's influence had become so consuming. The barn smelled of old wood and hay, and the sun filtered through the gaps in the boards, casting beams of light on the dusty floor. Ruth was the first to speak. "I think we need to talk about what's happening, for real." The others were silent, but their faces were tense, as if they had been waiting for someone to say the words. Alice, Rose, Betty, Evelyn, each one of them had their own doubts, but they had kept them hidden, buried under the weight of their loyalty to the Reverend and their families. "I don't think this prophecy is what we think it is," Ruth continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "I think he's using us. He's turning us into something we're not, and we're just letting him." Clara, who had been unusually quiet, looked up, her expression conflicted. "But what if it is real? What if this is our purpose? What if God really is trying to tell us something?" "That's what he wants you to believe," Rose snapped, her eyes flashing with frustration. "He wants you to think you're special, that you're chosen. But I don't believe that anymore. I don't think we're part of some divine plan. I think we're just part of his plan." The room fell into an uncomfortable silence as the weight of Rose's words sank in. For the first time, the girls were confronting the full extent of the Reverend's manipulation. They had been taught to worship him, to listen to his every word, to trust him above all else. And yet now it felt like they were the ones being betrayed. "I don't know what to do," Betty murmured. "If we go against him, what will happen to us? What will happen to our families?" "We can't live like this anymore," Evelyn said quietly, her eyes downcast. "We can't keep pretending everything's okay. I don't want to be part of whatever this is anymore." The words hung heavy in the air, but there was a sense of relief, too. For the first time, the girls were no longer alone in their doubts. They were united, sharing the same fears, the same concerns, and together they would find a way out. The next few days were filled with a sense of urgency. The girls knew they couldn't remain in Willow Creek much longer without facing the consequences of their actions. The Reverend had made it clear that anyone who questioned his teachings would be cast out, branded as a traitor to God, but the girls couldn't keep living under his thumb, their lives dictated by his prophecy. They needed a plan, but the question was, what kind of plan? How could they escape the suffocating grip of the church, their families, and the town? "I think we need to leave," Alice said one evening after much deliberation. "We can't stay here anymore. We need to get out." "Leave?" Mabel repeated, her voice trembling. "Where would we go?" "I don't know," Alice admitted. "But we can't stay here and let him control our lives any longer. We have to go somewhere, anywhere, where we can figure out what to do next." The girls exchanged uncertain glances, but there was a shared understanding. They had no real future in Willow Creek. Their lives had been reduced to mere pawns in the Reverend's game. But if they stayed, they would never be free. "We'll need money," Evelyn said, "and we'll need a place to go, a car, too." "I'll figure it out," Alice said. "I'll find a way. We'll leave tonight." But just as the girls were beginning to put their plan into motion, a new threat emerged, one that none of them had expected. Elijah Carter, the man they had once trusted, had sensed the unrest among his followers. He knew something was happening, something that was threatening his control over the town, and he would not let it go unnoticed. On the evening the girls were set to leave, the Reverend arrived at the barn with a small group of men from the congregation. His face was grim, but his voice was calm, almost eerily so. "You think you can escape me?" Elijah said, his eyes narrowing as he stepped forward. "You think you can run away from your destiny?" The girls froze, fear rising in their chests. They had been caught. The walls were closing in, and there was nowhere to hide. Elijah's voice grew colder, more threatening. "You were chosen for this, and you will fulfill your role. You will not abandon your duty, not now, not ever." And with those words the Reverend's true intentions became clear. He was no longer a man of faith. He was a man of power, and he would do anything to maintain control. The barn was deathly silent, save for the quiet rustling of hay beneath the weight of tense bodies. The Reverend's men stood at the entrance, their eyes scanning the group of girls with cold, assessing glares. Elijah's presence was suffocating, filling the space like a heavy fog. His hands, clasped in front of him, betrayed no sign of the fury that burned beneath the surface. He was calm, but there was a terrifying assurance in his stillness. Alice, her heart racing, stepped forward, trying to steady her trembling voice. "You don't control us anymore," she said, the words almost foreign to her own ears. For years, she had followed Elijah's every word, believing that his teachings were the path to salvation. But now, standing before him, something inside her had changed. The truth was no longer something she could deny. Elijah's lips curled into a slight, amused smile. "Do you really think you can defy God?" "Alice?" His voice was low, menacing. "You were chosen, and you will carry out your purpose, just as I have told you." "I don't believe that anymore," Ruth said, her voice gaining strength. She, too, had felt the weight of the Reverend's manipulation. The guilt, the confusion, it had all built up until it became a burden too heavy to bear. "We're not your puppets, Elijah. We're human beings, not tools for your prophecy." Elijah's smile faded, his eyes darkening with anger. "You know nothing of what you speak. This is not a matter of belief. This is destiny." Mabel stepped back, her breath shallow. "Destiny or your control?" she whispered, though it seemed as if she were speaking more to herself than anyone else. For the first time a flicker of frustration crossed Elijah's face. His fists clenched at his sides, but he quickly masked his emotions, replacing them with a calculated calm. "You think you can run away from what has been foretold? You think you can simply walk away from the destiny God has chosen for you?" Betty, who had been quietly listening, finally spoke up. "It's not God's plan. It's yours, Elijah. You've been using us, manipulating us all this time." The Reverend's eyes narrowed. "You have no idea the power I wield?" "Betty, you can try to escape, but the truth is that you cannot hide from what you are, what you were always meant to be." The girls huddled together, their hands clutching one another in silent support. The fear that had once paralyzed them was starting to give way to something else, defiance. They might not know exactly how they would escape, but they knew one thing for sure: they could no longer stay in the Reverend's grip. "We won't be part of your plan anymore," Alice declared, her voice steady now. "We won't live in fear of you any longer." There was a long pause, and for a moment Elijah said nothing. Then, with chilling clarity, he spoke. "Very well," he said, his voice cutting through the tension. "But understand this. If you leave without protection. You leave without my blessing. You leave without your families. There will be no turning back. I'll make sure of it." The girls exchanged worried glances. The weight of his words pressed down on them like a stone. To leave now meant everything they had known would be lost, their families, their homes, their place in the town. They would be exiled, outcasts, and the Reverend would make sure they could never return. "We're ready for that," Ruth said quietly. "We'll find a way." Eilinge's eyes flashed with fury, but he didn't move. He stood there, his presence still looming, as if daring them to make a move. "You think you can go against me and come out unscathed?" he sneered. "You will regret this. All of you?" The girls didn't answer. There was nothing left to say. They had made their choice. They would leave. As the Reverend and his men retreated, leaving the barn with a promise of vengeance hanging in the air, the girls felt a mixture of relief and fear. The decision had been made, but the consequences were still unknown. What would happen when the town discovered their defiance? What would happen when their families realized they had gone against Elijah's will? But in that moment, none of it mattered. They had taken the first step toward freedom. As night fell over Willow Creek, the girls gathered their things and prepared to leave. They had no clear destination in mind, but it didn't matter. They would find a place, any place, where they could finally breathe without fear. The road ahead was uncertain, but they knew one thing for sure. They couldn't go back. The path they were walking was a dangerous one, but it was the only one they could take if they wanted to reclaim their lives. And as they stepped out into the night, the moon casting an eerie light over the dusty streets, they were no longer the girls that the town had once known. They were something new, something more. The girls walked through the night, their feet heavy with the weight of their decision. With each step, the distance between them and the life they knew grew wider, and yet the uncertainty of what lay ahead loomed larger. The roads leading out of Willow Creek seemed endless, winding through unfamiliar terrain, as if the town itself was a distant memory fading behind them. They had no destination in mind, only a desperate need to escape. They knew they couldn't go back, not after what they had said to Elijah, and certainly not after what they had chosen to do. It was terrifying, and yet it was liberating. They were free, in a way, but freedom came at a steep cost. "There's no turning back now," Mabel whispered, her voice trembling as she glanced over her shoulder at the distant town. "What will happen when they realize we're gone, our families?" Betty shook her head, her eyes hardening. "We'll face it. We have to. We can't live in fear anymore, not under his control, not under anyone's control." Alice, who had been leading the group, paused for a moment. She had always been the one to take charge, but tonight even her usual certainty felt like a fragile thing. What if they couldn't make it out? What if their defiance only made things worse? But looking at her friends, seeing the determination in their eyes, Alice knew that there was no other choice. They had to keep moving forward. "I know it's scary," Alice said, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside her. "But we can do this. We'll figure it out. We've made it this far, haven't we?" Ruth nodded. "We'll find somewhere. We'll make a new life, together." As the hours passed, the girls trudged onward, their exhaustion growing with every step. They had no idea where they were going, but there was something freeing about being out in the open, away from the prying eyes of Willow Creek. No more whispers, no more watching over their shoulders. For the first time, they could breathe freely. But as the night deepened, so did their fears. They could feel the weight of the world pressing down on them. They were alone. No one knew where they were, and soon they would be hunted, not just by Elijah, but by their own families, their own past. The morning sun began to rise, casting long shadows over the land. The girls paused to rest, sitting on a weathered bench beside an old gas station. They were miles away from Willow Creek, but they knew it was only a matter of time before the Reverend's men started looking for them. "I don't want to go back," Hazel murmured, her eyes hollow with exhaustion. "But I don't know how long we can keep running." "We'll figure something out," Clara said, her voice barely above a whisper. "We'll have to. We can't just hide forever." And then, as if the universe had been listening, a car appeared in the distance, its headlights cutting through the morning fog. The girls stiffened, their hearts racing. It was impossible to tell if it was just a passing traveler or someone looking for them. It slowed as it approached, the sound of the engine echoing in the stillness. The car came to a halt in front of them, and the door creaked open. A man stepped out, tall, broad-shouldered, with a weathered face and dark eyes that held no kindness. He was wearing a faded denim jacket, and his boots kicked up dirt as he walked toward them. "Lost, girls?" he asked, his voice gravelly. The question hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. The girls exchanged nervous glances. Should they trust him? Should they even speak to him? There was a moment of silence before Alice took a step forward. "We're not lost," she said, her voice firm but tinged with uncertainty. "We're just trying to get away." The man eyed them for a moment as if weighing their words. He didn't seem surprised by their answer. In fact, he seemed to have been expecting it. "You're running from something, aren't you?" he asked, his gaze flicking over each of them, his expression unreadable. We need to get out of here," Betty said, her voice breaking slightly. "We can't go back. Not to Willow Creek." The man's lips curled into a thin smile. "I figured as much." The girls tensed, unsure of what to make of this stranger. Was he someone sent by Elijah? Someone who might hurt them? Or was he just a man who understood the need to escape? "I can help you," the man said, his voice low and steady. "But you have to understand that help comes with a price. I don't do charity." Alice took a step back, her instincts screaming for caution. "Who are you?" she demanded, her voice firm. "What do you want from us?" The man sighed, a trace of amusement in his eyes. "I'm a man with connections. I can get you out of here, but you won't be able to go back. You'll have to start over far from Willow Creek, and that's not something you can undo." The girls exchanged looks, their faces a mixture of fear and hope. This was their chance to truly escape, but it came with unknown consequences. "What's the price?" Alice asked, her voice barely a whisper. The man smiled again, but there was no warmth in it. "A favor one day. When I call on you, you'll come. No questions asked. You'll owe me." It was a dangerous deal, but what choice did they have? They had nothing left. "We'll do it," Alice said, her voice steady despite the uncertainty in her heart. "We'll take your help." The journey with the stranger didn't last much longer. He led them down winding roads, past sleepy towns, and into the outskirts of a city they couldn't name. There were no questions, no unnecessary conversations. The girls stayed quiet, each lost in their thoughts, feeling the weight of the choice they had made. What had they gotten themselves into? Were they truly free, or had they just swapped one prison for another? The man, whose name they never learned, dropped them off at a small, dingy motel. He didn't wait for them to thank him, nor did he ask for any promises. He simply drove off as if they were nothing more than another transaction in a long list of things he'd done. They stood outside the motel, staring up at the flickering neon sign. It was the first time in weeks that they had been allowed to stand still, but the sense of relief was short-lived. They were in a new place, far from Willow Creek, but they were still running. They had no money, no plan, and only the vaguest sense of what they were going to do next. "Is this really the life we want?" Mabel asked, her voice shaky as she glanced back at the road, as if expecting to see Elijah's men coming after them. "We just made a deal with a stranger. Who knows what he's going to ask of us?" "I know," Alice said, her voice softer than usual. "But we couldn't stay. We couldn't let him control us anymore. We have to keep moving forward," Betty added. "We've come this far. I don't know what's ahead, but I can't go back." The other girls nodded, their expressions torn between fear and resolve. They didn't know how long they could keep running. Their money wouldn't last forever, and the weight of what they had done, the pain they had caused their families, the destruction they had left behind, was beginning to settle in their hearts. But there was one thing that was clear. They couldn't go back. They couldn't return to the life they once knew, a life dictated by the rigid expectations of the town and the iron grip of Reverend Elijah Carter. They had chosen to break free, and now they would have to live with the consequences. The next few days were a blur. They spent their time in the motel, only venturing out when necessary. It was a strange freedom, one they had never known before. They weren't being watched. No one was judging them. But at the same time, it felt hollow. There were no smiles, no laughter. It was as if they had lost a part of themselves in the process of running away. The stranger had told them to stay low, not to draw attention to themselves. He had promised that he would help them later when the time came. But the girls knew the cost of his help. They had made a bargain, one they couldn't take back. Alice felt the pressure building inside her. What if they made the wrong choice? What if the cost was too high? The uncertainty gnawed at her, but she couldn't show weakness. Not now, not after everything they had been through. It wasn't long before they realized that being free came with a price they hadn't expected. Isolation. The town they were in, though bigger than Willow Creek, was still small enough that word traveled fast. People whispered in the streets, and eyes followed them wherever they went. They were strangers in a strange land, no better than fugitives, but the girls kept their heads down. They learned to live in silence, to survive by blending in, by pretending that they were just like everyone else. They found temporary work cleaning houses, waiting tables, but none of it brought them any closer to a sense of home. It was all just a means to an end, and they knew it. Weeks passed, and the world outside seemed to move on without them. They lived in limbo, between the past and the future, trapped in the uncertainty of their choices. The more they thought about the stranger's deal, the more they questioned whether they had made a mistake. What would he ask of them? What price would they have to pay? Then one day the call came. The phone in the motel room rang, its shrill sound breaking the silence that had settled over the girls. Alice's heart skipped a beat as she rushed to answer it. She knew somehow that it was time. "This is Alice," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "Get ready." The man's voice came through the receiver, as cold and detached as ever. "It's time to repay your debt." Alice felt her stomach drop. She looked over at the other girls, all of them sitting on the edge of the bed, waiting for some sign of what was to come. What you want us to do?" she asked, her throat tight. The man's laugh echoed on the other end of the line. "Don't worry, it's nothing complicated. You'll know when it's time." And just like that, the conversation ended. The line went dead, leaving Alice holding the phone in her trembling hands. "What do we do now?" Mabel whispered, her face pale. "What does he want from us?" Alice didn't have an answer. The girls had escaped one nightmare, but they were about to walk into another. The weight of their choices, the consequences of their freedom, were about to come crashing down on them. They weren't ready for this. No one ever could be. The night was long and quiet, each of the girls lying awake in their separate beds, staring at the peeling walls of the motel room. The air felt thick with dread. Alice, who had always been the most composed, couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was about to happen. She had known from the moment they agreed to leave Willow Creek that there would be consequences, but this was different. The man's cold voice still echoed in her mind. "It's time to repay your debt." Mabel was the first to break the silence. "What do you think he wants from us?" she asked, her voice trembling. She sat up in bed, her dark hair falling around her face like a curtain. "I can't keep doing this, whatever this is." Betty, who had been staring blankly at the ceiling, let out a long, slow breath. "We don't have a choice. We made a deal. We need to pay him back. But how?" Mabel's voice cracked. "We don't even know what he really wants from us. He hasn't told us anything." The uncertainty hung in the air, suffocating them. They had run away from the tight grip of their old lives, believing that they could escape the prophecy and the control of Reverend Elijah Carter. But now they were trapped in a new kind of prison, one created by a man whose motives were as opaque as the night outside. Alice rose from her bed, pacing back and forth. "We need to find out what he's really after. There has to be more to this. He wouldn't help us for nothing." Her words hung in the air, a mix of determination and fear. She had always been the leader, the one who kept things together. But now, for the first time, she wasn't sure what to do next. "Maybe it's time to call him," she said, her voice quieter now, almost to herself. Betty shook her head. "What if he wants something worse? What if we can't walk away from it?" "We need to know what he wants," Alice insisted. "We can't just sit here waiting for him to come knocking. We need answers." Without another word, Alice picked up the phone and dialed the number they had been given. The line rang several times before it was picked up. The voice on the other end was calm, familiar, almost too calm. "You called," the man said, his voice devoid of emotion. Alice took a deep breath. "We need to know what you want from us." The man chuckled softly, as if he were amused by her question. "What I want from you? Nothing complicated, Alice. Just do as I ask when the time comes. The price will be small." Alice's stomach tightened. The price will be small. How many times had he used that line? What if the price wasn't small at all? What if it was something that they couldn't come back from? "I don't trust you," Alice said, her voice shaking with barely contained anger. "You've lied to us before. We need to know exactly what you expect." The line fell silent for a moment. Then, finally, the man spoke again, his tone almost pitying. "I'm sorry, Alice, but you don't get to make the rules. You agreed to the deal. I'm simply following through. And when the time comes, you'll understand." Before she could respond, the line went dead. Alice stood there, holding the phone, her heart racing. She could feel the weight of his words hanging in the air. "You'll understand." It was as if he were mocking her, as if he were toying with her, and worse, with all of them. "What did he say?" Betty asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "He won't tell us what he wants," Alice replied, her voice trembling. "He said we'll understand when the time comes." The girls exchanged uneasy glances. No one spoke for a long time, the fear of the unknown settling over them like a thick fog. What had they gotten themselves into? Was this really what they had wanted? Had they truly escaped one nightmare only to walk straight into another? Alice collapsed onto the bed, burying her face in her hands. The weight of everything, of the lies, of their pasts, of their futures, was too much to bear. She couldn't stop the tears from falling. They had run away, but it seemed like there was no place where they could truly hide. Mabel sat beside her, her hand on Alice's shoulder. "We'll figure this out. We're together, and that's what matters." Alice didn't say anything. She didn't know if together was enough anymore. It was hard to believe that when they had so little left. The next day woke up to a knock at the door. They all froze, the familiar sensation of panic surging through them. Was this it? Was the time finally here? The knock came again, louder this time. Alice glanced at the others, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't want to answer it, but she knew she had no choice. She stood up and walked slowly toward the door. Her hand shook as she reached for the knob. With a deep breath, she opened it. Standing in the doorway was a man they didn't recognize, tall, with dark sunglasses and a suit that looked far too expensive for a small motel like this. He smiled faintly, but it was a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "You're wanted," he said simply. "It's time to come with me." Alice's blood ran cold. It wasn't the stranger they had met before. This was someone else, someone who was clearly here for business. The man stepped aside as if expecting her to follow. There was no offer, no explanation, just a cold demand. "What's going on?" Alice demanded, her voice shaky. "What do you want from us?" The man didn't respond. He simply gestured toward the car parked outside. A black sedan with tinted windows. Alice looked back at the others. They were all standing in the room, watching her, waiting for her decision. There was no turning back now. Alice nodded, her heart sinking. "We don't have a choice." She stepped out of the room, the man following behind her. One by one, the others followed, the weight of their decision pressing down on them. The car was waiting, its engine running softly, as if it, too, was aware of the gravity of what was to come. The black sedan seemed to swallow them whole as they climbed into the back seat, one by one. The man in the suit didn't say a word as he drove, the engine purring like a beast ready to pounce. Alice sat next to Mabel, who was clutching her hands tightly in her lap. The others were just as tense, their faces pale and drawn with fear, the silence in the car thick and suffocating. Alice couldn't shake the feeling that they were heading toward something inevitable, something they couldn't control. The road stretched before them, dark and unfamiliar, but it didn't matter. There was no turning back now. The man had made that clear. The only sound in the car was the low hum of the tires on the road, and the occasional glance exchanged between the girls. None of them spoke. Words seemed too dangerous at this point. Alice kept her eyes fixed on the rearview mirror, watching the reflection of the man as he drove. His face was unreadable, but his posture was relaxed, almost too calm for the situation they were in. It was as if he didn't think they could resist. And maybe they couldn't, after what felt like an eternity. The car pulled off the main road and onto a narrow, unpaved path. The trees were dense here, the kind that seemed to close in on you as you passed. Alice's stomach twisted. This wasn't a place anyone would come unless they were forced to. The world outside the car felt like it was fading away, replaced by an eerie quiet that only deepened her sense of dread. The car slowed and stopped in front of a large, imposing building that seemed to rise out of the darkness. It looked old, with iron gates and heavy stone walls that loomed like a fortress. There were no lights, only shadows and the distant glow of the moon. Alice swallowed hard, her throat dry. She didn't know what was waiting for them behind those gates, but she had a sinking feeling that it wasn't going to be good. The man got out of the car without a word, then opened the door for Alice. She hesitated, staring at the gates, but there was no time to second-guess. Mabel was already climbing out, her eyes wide with fear. "It's time," the man said simply, his voice like a whip, sharp and final. Alice could feel the weight of his words pressing down on her. What had they gotten themselves into? One by one, the girls filed out of the car. They walked in silence, following the man up to the gates. As they crossed the threshold, Alice couldn't help but notice how cold the air had become. The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end. Inside, the building was dimly lit, with long hallways and closed doors. The air smelled stale, like dust and something else, something faintly metallic. They were led down a narrow corridor until they reached a small room at the end. The man opened the door and gestured for them to go inside. The room was sparse, with nothing but a single wooden table in the center and a few chairs scattered around. It looked like a place meant for waiting, not for living. The girls filed in, their eyes scanning the room, each of them uncertain of what would happen next. The man closed the door behind them, leaving them alone. "I don't like this," Mabel whispered, looking around at the walls as if they might close in on her. Betty, who had been unusually quiet, spoke up. "What do we do now?" Alice stood at the center of the room, her mind racing. They had been brought here for a reason, but what was it? She had to know what came next, and she had to make sure they weren't being played. She walked toward the table and slammed her hand down, causing the others to jump. "We need answers." The sound of a door opening behind them made everyone freeze. Alice turned quickly, her heart pounding. A figure stood in the doorway, a tall man in a dark suit, his face familiar, though it took Alice a moment to place him. It was Reverend Elijah Carter. His appearance was as unsettling as ever. His face was calm, almost serene, but his eyes were sharp, calculating, as though he had seen everything and understood more than he let on. "I see you've arrived," he said, his voice smooth and steady. "I was wondering when you'd get here." Alice's heart raced. She had expected to confront someone like him. But the reality of seeing him in person, after all they had been through, felt different. His presence was oppressive, like a shadow that loomed over them all. "What do you want from us?" Alice demanded, her voice shaking with a mix of anger and fear. "We did what you asked. We did everything you told us to do. So why are we here?" Reverend Carter smiled, a small, almost imperceptible smile. "You've done well. You followed the path laid out before you, and now you're ready for the next step." "Next step?" Betty echoed, her voice cracking. "What does that even mean?" "It means," Carter said, his voice suddenly turning colder, "that you're ready to fulfill your purpose. You see, this wasn't about the babies. It was never about that." The girls exchanged confused glances. What was he talking about? "Then what was it about?" Alice asked, her fists clenched at her sides. The Reverend's smile faded, replaced by a look of cold determination. "It was about power. It was about control. It was about preparing you to become the leaders of this new world." Alice felt a chill crawl up her spine. "Leaders? What are you talking about?" "Leaders of a new community," Carter continued, his eyes gleaming with fervor. "You are the chosen ones, destined to lead the people of Willow Creek into a new age. You are the ones who will guide them to salvation." The words hit Alice like a slap to the face. Salvation? A new age? She didn't understand. This wasn't what she had signed up for. She had been told they were part of a prophecy, but she never imagined it would lead to this. The Reverend stepped closer, his presence overwhelming. "But you see, my dear Alice, this isn't just about your faith. It's about your sacrifice. You will give everything, your bodies, your lives, for the greater good. And when the time comes, you'll understand that it was all worth it." The room felt smaller with every word he spoke. Alice's breath caught in her throat. The horror of what he was saying began to sink in. This wasn't just about religion or prophecy. This was about control, about taking everything they had. And there was no escaping it. The silence that followed Reverend Carter's chilling words hung in the air like a dense fog. The girls stood frozen, unable to move or speak, their minds reeling from the gravity of his revelation. Alice felt as though the ground beneath her had suddenly disappeared, leaving her suspended in an abyss of confusion and fear. She could feel the weight of their stares, the pressure of 13 girls, all struggling to comprehend the unimaginable reality they were being thrust into. The Reverend's words echoed in her mind, growing louder with each passing second. Leaders of a new community. Your bodies, your lives for the greater good. Alice's vision blurred, her hands trembling. The walls of the room seemed to close in, the air thick and suffocating. She had known something was off, but this was beyond anything she had imagined. The Reverend had manipulated them, twisted their faith, and used their trust as tools for something far darker than any of them could have foreseen. Mabel was the first to break the silence, her voice small and fragile. "Is this really happening? Did we just sign up for this?" Alice looked at her, her heart heavy with guilt. "I don't know anymore. But I know one thing, we can't let him control us. We can't let him use us like this." The other girls were starting to stir, their faces a mixture of fear, anger, and disbelief. Betty clenched her fists, her eyes burning with rage. "We were raised to believe in something pure, something good. And now this This is what we get. Alice turned to the Reverend, her voice shaking but defiant. You're a monster. This isn't faith. This isn't salvation. This is manipulation. Reverend Carter's expression remained unchanged, his calm demeanor unshaken. He stepped closer, his voice soft yet firm. It's not for you to understand yet, Alice. You will in time. You're not meant to know everything now. But trust me when I say, this is the way. This is the path that has been chosen for you. No, Alice spat, her anger rising. You don't get to decide what's chosen for me. You don't get to decide my fate. You've taken everything from us already, but we still have a choice. We're not your puppets. Carter's smile returned, but it was a cold, calculating smile, one that made Alice's blood run cold. You think you have a choice? The moment you were born into this town, you were already part of the plan. You've always been part of it, don't you see, Alice? You can't escape your destiny. It's been written in the stars. Alice felt a surge of panic rise within her. She had spent her entire life believing that the Reverend's words were truth, that his vision was divine. But now, with the veil pulled away, she saw it for what it truly was, a twisted, monstrous lie. We're not your sacrifices, Alice said, her voice breaking. We're not your tools to achieve whatever sick agenda you have. The Reverend's eyes flashed with something that resembled amusement, but it was short-lived. He stepped back, his hands clasped behind his back. You're right. You're not sacrifices. You're vessels. The world will need you, Alice, and when the time comes, you will be ready. Alice took a step forward, her resolve hardening. We won't let you win. We won't let you turn us into what you want us to be. At that moment, the door to the room opened with a sharp creak, and the man in the suit from earlier stepped inside. His expression was unreadable as he scanned the room, his eyes settling on the Reverend. It's time, the man said, his voice flat. The Reverend nodded slowly, never breaking his gaze from Alice. Yes, it's time. Alice's stomach churned with dread. She didn't know what time meant, but she had a sinking feeling that it wasn't going to be good. We're leaving, the man said, his tone final. You've served your purpose. Now it's time for the next phase. The Reverend gave Alice one last look, his smile returning. You'll understand soon. This is bigger than you, bigger than all of us. But in the end, you'll see that I was right. As the man in the suit began ushering the girls toward the door, Alice felt a cold wave of panic rise within her. They had been led here, trapped by their own belief, and now they were being thrown into something far worse than they could have ever imagined. But she wouldn't give up. Not now. Not ever. They had to find a way out. Alice's mind raced, searching for any escape, any opportunity to break free from the nightmare they had been pulled into. But the more she thought about it, the clearer it became. The only way to fight back was to expose the truth that Reverend Carter was a liar, a manipulator, and whatever plan he had, they weren't going to be part of it. The girls were herded down the narrow hallway, each step heavy with uncertainty. Alice's heart beat erratically in her chest, the sound almost deafening in her ears. Every fiber of her being screamed for her to escape, but they were trapped. The Reverend's men, the ones who had been watching them for weeks, made sure of that. As they were led to a waiting van, the cold air outside seemed to bite at their skin. but it did little to ease the terror gnawing at Alice. She glanced over at the other girls, but their eyes were vacant, drained of hope, lost in a fog of confusion. Alice could feel the weight of their collective fear, a palpable force that seemed to tie them all together. They climbed into the van without a word, the door slamming shut behind them with an unsettling finality. The man in the suit took the driver's seat, his face expressionless as he started the engine. Alice could barely breathe as the vehicle rumbled to life, its tires crunching over the gravel road. Where were they going? What did they want from them? The questions swirled in her mind, but the answers eluded her. She stole a glance at the girls around her. Mabel's face was pale, her hands trembling in her lap. Betty was staring out the window, her expression a mixture of defiance and fear. But Alice knew one thing: this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. They drove in silence for what seemed like hours, the landscape around them blurring as they left Willow Creek behind. The tension inside the van was thick, and every now and then Alice caught a glimpse of the man's cold eyes in the rearview mirror, watching them. As they neared their destination, Alice's mind raced. She needed to find a way to get them out. There had to be something she could do. She couldn't let the Reverend and his followers win. Not when they were so close to the truth. The van slowed as it approached a secluded building, hidden in the woods at the edge of town. It was an old farmhouse, the kind of place people in Willow Creek whispered about, but never dared approach. The man parked the van in front of the large wooden structure, his movements deliberate and slow. "Out," he commanded, his voice sharp. "All of you, get out." The girls hesitated, exchanging uncertain glances, but Alice was the first to move. She pushed the door open and stepped out, her legs unsteady beneath her. The air was cold, and the faint smell of rotting wood filled her nose. The building loomed before them like a fortress, its windows dark and lifeless. The Reverend's voice broke the silence as he stepped out from behind the building, his presence as imposing as ever. His face was calm, but there was something in his eyes, a cold, calculating gleam that made Alice's skin crawl. "This is where you will fulfill your purpose," he said, his voice low but steady. "This is where the prophecy will come to fruition." Alice could feel the bile rise in her throat. This was it, the moment they had all been dreading, the point of no return. But she wouldn't let it happen. She took a deep breath, summoning every ounce of courage within her. She could feel the others' eyes on her, their silent plea for someone to lead them, to show them the way out. She wasn't about to let them down. "We're not doing this," Alice said, her voice stronger than she felt. "We're not your puppets. We're not going along with whatever sick plan you have." Reverend Carter smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "You don't understand yet, Alice, but you will. You'll see why this is necessary." "We've seen enough," Alice retorted, her hands clenched into fists. "We've seen what you're really about. You've been lying to us all along." The Reverend's expression faltered for a moment, and Alice could see the flicker of doubt in his eyes. It was brief, but it was enough. She had him on the edge. "You can't stop what's coming," he said, his voice shaking for the first time. "This is bigger than all of you." Alice took a step forward, her gaze never leaving his. "No, you've used our faith. You've used our trust, but we're not going to let you destroy us." For a long moment the Reverend said nothing. His eyes narrowed, and the air between them seemed to crackle with tension. Alice could hear the sound of footsteps behind her. Mabel, Betty, and the others were beginning to gather around, their strength slowly returning. Then, without warning, the Reverend turned and signaled to the men behind him. "Take them inside," he ordered, his voice cold once more. But Alice wasn't backing down. She wasn't going to let them be dragged into that building, not without a fight. She glanced at Mabel, then at Betty, and nodded. Without another word, the three of them moved together, grabbing onto the arms of the girls closest to them, pulling them away from the men. The confusion among the men was palpable. They weren't prepared for resistance. The girls fought back with everything they had, pushing, shoving, kicking, anything to break free. For the first time in what felt like forever, Alice felt a spark of hope ignite within her. "We're leaving," Alice shouted, her voice trembling but resolute. "We're not going to be a part of this." Reverend Carter's eyes burned with fury. "You'll regret this," he spat. "You'll all regret this." But Alice wasn't listening. She was already pulling the others away from the building, her mind focused solely on escape. They had to get out of here. They had to warn the town, to expose the truth about the Reverend and his plans. As they ran, the sound of shouting and footsteps grew distant behind them. Alice's heart pounded in her chest, but she didn't stop. Not until she saw the lights of Willow Creek in the distance. They had made it. They had escaped. But this was only the beginning.